topic for today. I think this may be my last in the series of talks on what's happening in the world, especially since October 7th. The jarring, terrible events in Israel that I talked about last night. And today I want to talk about the jarring, terrible events that happened in our country when we saw in a light we've never seen before. Unless you are a close follower of the culture wars, you've never seen so clearly the forces that have taken over academic and intellectual discourse that are posited to be completely contrary to the founding values of our country, values that I think we take for granted. But because we take them so for granted, we actually don't know how to champion those causes. We don't know how to fight for what we believe in because we've taken it for granted, and we're fighting forces that have a. I think the theories are false theories. I think they're horrible theories, but they have an urgency and a kind of a cogency to them, even though they're false. They're based on something that coheres, at least apparently, and therefore we are unequipped to fight the battle against the theories more or less described as neo-Marxism, critical theory gone bad, and therefore any critical theory, including critical theories of justice, critical race theory, etc. They're all very, very bad. They're all inimical to the values of what I'll call the liberal state. By liberal state, I mean a state rooted in human rights, in limited government, checks and balances on government, a regulated free market, and allows for human beings to express their duties as human beings, although the government cannot require us to be moral. The government can only require us to be law-abiding, but our meaning as human beings is not only that we are rights endowed, but that we are duty endowed. There is something called human nature. There is something called good. There is something called righteous. There is something called truth. They're not simply constructs. And we take these things for granted, but they're under assault. Now, I think for me to use this Shabbat as the day to wrap this up is very serendipitous and powerful that this is also Martin Luther King weekend. Martin Luther King's birthday is Monday, January 15th. He was born in 1929. And if I were to pick one modern political philosopher who stands for the ideals in a deep, insistent way, the ideals of the liberal state, it would be Martin Luther King. Remember, Martin Luther King said, you don't judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, when you look at the critical theory today, a person is not judged by the content of their character. They're judged by their race, by their class, by what country they might be a citizen of, for example, Israel. Anything but content of character. In fact, the idea of content of character, virtuous, good, and righteous, are scoffed at as seen to being constructs of the bourgeois society that actually are inimical to the forces of radical revolution because they tend to ameliorate the problems of the human condition. This is the classic radical neo-Marxist critical critique of what we'll call the liberal state, is that the liberal state actually tries to improve the human condition, which I think is the job of the liberal state. For those who want revolution, they want things to be bad. They want things to be very bad so that there will be a revolution. What comes next, by the way, after the revolution, as Leonard Cohen said, whatever comes after America, you're not going to like it. They don't share with us any program of what's next. But when you look at how people in this neo-Marxist critical theory DEI group live, it's number one, very hazy, but filled with bigotry, filled with racism, filled with a kind of a fascism, that there will be no democracy. People won't decide what kind of government they want. It will be imposed by elites who are empowered by this critical theory. The way of saying it is, I think that those who are involved in this neo-Marxist critical theory, they're not elected to any office. They've never reasoned their way into authority. They just claim authority and then hound other people out by trying to shame them, especially with arguments of white guilt. So it's the taking of authority, not what I would call actually legitimate authority, which from our perspective, legitimate authority comes from the will of the people in democratic elections. That's why Martin Luther King called himself a democratic socialist. Why not just a socialist? Because he knew that the communist and socialist states of his time, none of them were democratic, none of them respected human rights. So for him to call himself a socialist, he had to put in front of that a democratic socialist, meaning whatever kind of economic regime you want to set up, it has to be set up by the people in elections. That any kind of authority, any kind of power is legitimized only by the will of the people that is expressed in democratic elections. Now, as I've been teaching through these months, clearly there are major problems, inequities in the liberal state, but the liberal state is committed through legislation, through court decisions, to a constant amelioration of the moral imperfections of the liberal state, which means the arc is toward justice. The arc is toward making the liberal state as just as possible. So what many people do is they point out the moral problems of the liberal state as a way to delegitimize the liberal state in general. But I want you to consider this. I want you to think about the life of Martin Luther King. I want you to think about the United States in 1955 versus 1965. When anybody says that our moral ideas are constructs that are simply rooted in society, my question is, then how do societies change? If morals are fabrications of a society at a given time, then change isn't possible unless there's a part of the human being, in addition to desire, in addition to reason, in addition to rationality, there's another part which is called the human moral reasoning dimension that can look at what we want and say, yes, I want that, but it's not right. You can say, well, this would benefit my group, but you say to yourself, but that's not actually good for the country. So if you look at the change in America between 1955 and 1965 with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, etc., our country fundamentally changed its moral identity for many, many reasons. But I think we're to pick one person, one voice that led the transformation of America between 1955 and 1965, it would be Martin Luther King, because he believed in the liberal state. He believed that it was imperfect, highly imperfect, but it could be corrected through persuasion of people on what was moral. Now, I want us to take a very deep breath and think about this. I was alive during this time. I saw Martin Luther King on television. You have to be of a certain age to remember this. But dramatic change was afoot. And how this change happened? Appeals were being made to our conscience all over the country. All over the country, there was an appeal to what it meant to be an American in the ideal sense, meaning someone committed to American values. And the speeches of Martin Luther King caused a national, not only I think an inner reassessment, but a national kind of remorse, a national kind of shame of what we had tolerated under a liberal constitutional government, and a common desire to transform. The transformation is still taking place. But how did our country transform? Because an appeal was made to the American people in terms of our own values as a liberal state rooted in righteousness and goodness and truth. The nation rooted in righteousness and goodness and truth, therefore rooted in moral duties and human rights. Martin Luther King was able to make a case, by the way, from his perspective, deeply rooted in his belief in God and deeply rooted in that he was furthering God's mission, God's will, in bringing as much as possible perfection to the liberal state, where people would be judged not by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. So as we ask ourselves, how do we fight against these forces that have led to a corruption in our moral fabric? I believe, and having studied Martin Luther King again over this weekend, that studying his political philosophy and his religious ideology and studying his speeches reminds us of the power of the ideas and ideals of the liberal state and their powers to transform. Now, for many reasons that I don't need to go into, I don't want to turn my talk today into a history lecture. For many, many reasons, the morale of what I will call the American endeavor suffered during the civil rights, the struggles over civil rights in the 1960s, the Vietnam War. I would even add Watergate to that. There are many things that cause us to be unsure of ourselves. And I'd say on the intellectual front, there was a movement in the academy, meaning in universities, etc., where the idea of the possibility of the liberal state was critiqued in a deep way. Now, I remember this happening when I was in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, the idea of critical studies was gaining ascendance. And as I've been going through, trimming down my library, I'm finding book after book on critical legal theory, critical study of society, critical study of the structure of society. And over again, the authors are doubting ideas such as goodness, such as the will to the good, such as our belief that due process is possible, that human rights can be protected. Those on the critical theory side said, these are simply inventions by the bourgeois state, and there's actually no will to see things through. In all my reviewing of the books that I've bought and getting ready to get rid of, by the way, there's no advocacy for what replaces this other than the liberal state is hypocritical, inefficient, and does not make good on its promises, implying that it should be done away with, but never stating that it should be done away with, and never proposing what should come next. So I remember when I was in graduate school and studying critical legal theory, my doctoral work was mostly in the area of legal interpretation, legal hermeneutics. Also the influence of Jacques Derrida and others, the deconstruction movement. It's as if the reality, the belief that there is a moral reality was undercut, and it led to a kind of a vertigo. You actually could not make a moral pronouncement. If you made a moral pronouncement, you were seen to be as somehow an agent or a tool of the patriarchal agenda. So when you said that something is good or bad, we didn't discuss good or bad. We discussed how this term was used to manipulate and control marginalized people. You actually couldn't discuss good and evil. You couldn't discuss beauty. You couldn't discuss justice. It was all subsumed under the discussion that all such discussions are manipulations to further oppress marginalized people. Now, I remember being in this, and I remember these discussions occurring, and I thought to myself, well, they're just absurd. And I'll tell you why. This was a cogent thought that I had. Clearly, when they say that these terms are just being used in a rhetoric to oppress marginalized people, my question would be, and I asked it in some of these circles, so you're saying that it's bad to oppress marginalized people. You're saying it's a bad thing. People had a bit of trouble because clearly that's a moral judgment. Yes, it is a bad thing. And then I would ask, where does that judgment come from? Where does the judgment come from that, for example, white supremacy is bad? That's bad to oppress marginalized people. If all moral judgments are simply extractions from the social construct and none is better or worse than another, then how do you justify the judgments in the critical theory neo-Marxism that one kind of thinking is bad or evil, another kind of thinking is good, but you can never make a case for good or bad because the minute you try to make a case for good or bad, you're back into the rhetoric of manipulation by discussing these ideas as if they're real. So when you relent and say, okay, let's say postmodernism, none of these ideas refer to anything real, you create a kind of a vacuum, and then they slip in and impose their moral judgment on people. And as I was watching this, it was like watching sleight-of-hand magicians at work, a kind of an intellectual prestidigitation. And it was working on people. Now, I, as you can imagine, I was very much of a contrarian. There were people who behind the scenes would say, Finley, good job, keep it up. But I'm not going to do it because I don't want to risk my career. So there were people that said, I better just agree with these people because I want a career in academia. I only, in a very small way, aspired to a career in academia. I really preferred to be a rabbi and work with people. But I watched this happening around me. And I assume that some of you who are listening saw this as well. You had either, you're in college or in graduate school, you came in knowing that there are values such as love, justice, truth, beauty, righteousness, etc., that are worth discussing. They do refer to something real. They're not just things that are extracted out of the social context, because even if extracted out of the social context, human rights is better than slavery. Justice is better than injustice. However the thoughts came to be, we all knew that one was better than the other. When people come along and say one is not better than the other, they're just constructs, there's no good and bad, those people controlled the discussion. And it was very hard to debate them, but we all knew there was something very, very bad afoot. We fast forward to today, and what we've realized in trying to examine Israel's right to exist, try to examine the history of Israel-Palestine, try to understand the hatred of Israel, and trying to engage in any kind of reasonable historical analysis of what's happening, why it's happened, you run into these ideas of, first of all, postmodernism. There are no real values, which creates the vacuum for the I think imposed values of what I will call the neo-Marxian critical theory side, which is Israel is evil. White supremacy is evil. It's both everywhere and invisible. In the DEI forums, it's taken to be for granted, and there's a considerable amount of brainwashing to do. It's no mistake that the more successful DEI is, the movement for so-called diversity, equity, inclusion, and remember, it's the opposite. It is not about diversity, it's about silencing. It is not about equity as fairness, it's about creating an inequity based on race, based on position in society, and it's certainly not about inclusiveness. So the word, it's a hoax, it's a scam. The more successful DEI is, the more there is anti-Israel rhetoric against the West, against the United States, and in the most odd way imaginable, celebration of Hamas. Now, I can connect those dots for you, but I'm saying something that's all obvious to you, especially in watching Claudine Gray's testimony before Congress. Now, remember, if you look at her academic work, she's thoroughly ensconced in this DEI, in this neo-Marxian critical theory. And remember, she could not make a case that calling for genocide was a form of harassment of Jewish students. You probably saw that testimony. And you were probably as nauseated as I was. I don't mean nauseated simply, it made me sick. I mean, it gave me a kind of a moral vertigo that an accomplished academic could not bring herself to say, calling for genocide is evil. That a university president didn't have the wherewithal within herself to take a megaphone, go out and say, you people stop that. This is horrible what you're saying. Calling for genocide is reprehensible. You need to stop this. But instead what we've seen is universities have become breeding grounds for the most atrocious kind of hatred that we never, ever thought we would see again. So there were two calamities on October 7th. One calamity, of course, is what happened in Israel that I talked about last night. And the other calamity is actually a calamity that's been brewing for 50 years. We've finally seen it in its sharpest outline. And we people who stand for the values of Martin Luther King, who stand for the values of the liberal state, that you are judged by content of character, not the color of your skin or your position in class structure. The belief in the modern liberal state as the best arrangement for humanity. A regime based in rights, separation of powers, regulated free market. This is the best arrangement for human beings, and it's all its perfections. It has a self-correcting ability because it is more and more thoroughly democratic. That's what I believe in. I assume that's what you believe in. We are faced with people who have the power of the control of the conversation in the universities who don't believe that. They believe something else, and the more you go into what they do believe, it is reprehensible and it is morally offensive. And that's where our struggle lies. So I was asked last night about my assessment of the Israel being taken before the International Court of Justice with a charge of genocide. Again, it's nauseating as in repugnant, but it is clear there's an understanding that because of the genocide against the Jewish people in the Second World War, is somehow redounded to the benefit of the Jews in the establishment of the State of Israel, which is probably true. And therefore, the greatest way to delegitimize Israel is to take one of the elements that justify the State of Israel, which means genocide against the Jews, and accuse Israel of genocide, which is only an attempt to delegitimize the existence of the State of Israel. That's what's happening today. The fact that South Africa is behind this, we can talk about why that is another time. But remember, this idea is celebrated in the Arab world because it is an attempt to delegitimize Israel's right to exist, which is, of course, behind what Hamas did and behind Iran and so forth. So I mentioned last night, I would talk a little bit about the political situation today. Just two last things as I move toward the end of my talk. One is, you may remember that Israel was claiming that the funding going into Gaza, the 70 years of UN funding going for Palestinians, the only refugee group still in existence since the Second World War, and it's an astounding scandal that this is allowed to exist. There are historical reasons for it. I don't want to go into today, but the idea that the entire world is propping up the Hamas regime, and they've used the monies of the entire world to build this warren of tunnels that are only there for war making. And when I say war making, I mean committing atrocities, establishing rape camps, butchering people, and holding hostages. That's what the tunnels are for. They're not air raid tunnels for Gazans to take shelter when they actually start a war and get bombed. You would imagine they'd be filled with Gazans in air raid shelters. They're not air raid shelters. They're only built to attack Israeli civilians. Israel claimed these tunnels were there. In fact, one person actually shared with me, Israel had diagrams of the tunnels. They said, we know they're there. Of course, what they knew was about 1/100th of what was actually there. And they also knew that the mosques and United Nations schools were hiding places for munitions factories, storage of munitions, and launching of munitions, hospitals as well. Now, nobody would believe Israel. People said this is just Israeli propaganda. Hospitals are not used as centers for terror. Mosques are not used for those purposes. UN schools are not used for those purposes. Because of the Israeli invasion of Gaza, what's been shown as people claimed, and they were told they were told that they were kooky to believe that mosques, schools, hospitals were used as staging grounds for terrorism. It's demonstrated to be utterly true, and therefore, in my mind, the United Nations has lost all credibility as a force for any kind of good. In my mind, in the entire world, it's so thoroughly infected with anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiment that I think everything they do, as you know from their decisions that are being made, it seems as if Israel is the greatest evil that has ever made its presence in the world, is a very peculiar obsession. By the way, if you want to read evidence in this, go to UN Watch, run by Hillel Neuer, N-E-U-R. It's really heartbreaking to see how much the UN has become a force for evil in the Middle East. So what's happened in Israel? Israelis believe that international organizations such as the UN, such as the UN Commission to Aid Palestinian Refugees, they have become organizations dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel. The greatest light in all of this, of course, is the United States. And these times I'm very, very proud to be an American. People critique, I think, some of the edges of American policy, critique some of the statements made by the Secretary of State and by President Biden. I think they are politically necessary. I'm excusing them because of the political reality. If you look at the actions of the United States, it is the greatest force to protect the state of Israel. I think in Israel's interest, but it's also in American interest that Iran, China, and Russia do not become the dominant powers in the world. Everything we stand for in the project of the liberal state is in danger because of this new axis of evil, and the front line of this fight, of this axis for evil, to establish regimes in the world that are antithetical to what we stand for, to what Martin Luther King stood for. The front line is in the state of Israel today. I would hope that even if I weren't Jewish and so dedicated to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people, that I would be as in favor of our bringing the fight there as I am being a Jew and very, of course, partial to the state of Israel. I'm very heartened that so many Americans understand what is at stake, that every good American should understand what's at stake in this war in the Middle East and what's at stake in the struggle to take back our university and educational systems. It is existential. It is real. It's happening now. It's happening in our time. We have to take a stand. We have to mobilize ourselves. There's something very, very evil afoot, and it's in front of us, and we have to do something about it. Now, as I said at the very beginning of all this, I will dedicate some part of the rest of my thinking and speaking life to this fight. I hope now that this is over, I can get some good writing done and make my contribution to analyzing what has happened and what we ought to do. I think I have something to add in that, and I'll be, of course, sharing all of that with you. So, as I said earlier, I think we are wrapping up this first round of the battle from October 7th until now. I think celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday is an excellent way to give us both retrospective on what has happened and why. And we can talk about that much more deeply in time to come, exactly how we got here. It's a very complex story, but the dots are easily connected. And once we understand what has happened, we understand what it is that we have to do. My hope is that this fight to defeat Iran's interests in the Middle East will eventually see its end in the weakening of the Iranian regime. I hope they have overstepped, and that the regime will be weakened, because without Iran, Hamas and the Hezbollah, they won't be able to survive without the support of Iran, which of course, by extension, means the support of Russia and very probably China. That's where the war is. There's a lot to be done. I hope to give you all very practical ideas on how to do it. And I hope that in my future discussions on Friday night and Shabbos morning, we can go back to the moral, spiritual, inner life dimensions of Judaism, Western religion, philosophy in general. But this topic will never, ever be far from my mind.